First of all, I want to welcome everyone for coming. I know it's a rainy day, and I really know this person well. He's spoken several times here, and every time he talks about our particular region of the state, it's always an excellent talk. So Professor Ted Campbell is, of course, our speaker today, and he's going to be speaking on the Texas Revolution in Southeast Texas. So I'd like to have everybody welcome him, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and happy San Jacinto Day. I understand we've actually had two competing events, one down at the courthouse and one this event going on here, and we may actually have some people coming in. But I'm delighted to see a crowd like this on a rainy day in April in Beaumont, because I wasn't expecting it. I've taught through my career at theological schools. Now, I'm a historian teaching history of Methodism and history of Christianity. But one of the things I always tell students at a theological school is that when you get out there in a church, you never put out too many chairs. You always put out too few, and then it looks great if you have to go get extra chairs to fill in, which we did today, see, so I like it. I'm going to begin with a place and a name. This region where we are, Texas, including Southeast Texas, was once called Sayamne by the Atakapa people of this region who lived here and whose descendants do indeed still live in this area, despite what we may have been taught in 4th grade and 7th grade Texas history. One of them worked in this library until very recently, a descendant, and she remembered her father teaching her to say, we were a-ka-ka-pa, to pronounce those 4 syllables of the name of the native people. In their language, Sayamne meant Spanish land, and that's documented by Smithsonian scholars who talked to women in Lake Charles. And I was just talking about one of the women who died in Port Arthur in 1920, and she was the daughter of some of these Atakapa folks. But I want to honor the memory of the native people as we consider the Texas Revolution, but look for a book coming out later this year with the title Sayamne. It's my book I've been working on since 1982, and it's the history of my native place. It's a very personal book, as well as a book that I hope has solid and documented history about this region. Spanish land, which it had been, but as late as May 1821, this was, in fact, Spanish land, but not for long. By the summer of that year, Texas had become part of a newly independent Mexico, joined politically with the state of Coahuila. So we were part of the state of Coahuila y Texas, Coahuila in Texas. And then just 15 years later, in 1836, Texas declared its own independence and became a republic. So in the span of a single generation, this land passed from Spain to Mexico to Texas. Now, if you listen closely to the language of that time, one word keeps rising to the surface: freedom, libertad in Spanish. You even see it stamped on coins of the new Mexican Republic. Dios y libertad, God and freedom. The phrase captured the spirit of the age, an age shaped by Enlightenment ideas, by revolutions, by new political experiments, by networks like Masonic lodges that were spreading these ideas across both Mexico and the United States. This was a time when Texas itself was about to become free from Spain and then from Mexico. But freedom did not mean just one thing. It could mean the freedom of one region from a distant national government, the freedom of one nation from another nation, the freedom to cross borders and claim land, the freedom to trade without restriction, or more troublingly in this place, freedom for enslaved people, a question that remained unresolved and deeply contested through this period. So when we talk about the Texas Revolution, especially here in Southeast Texas, we're really talking about a struggle over the meaning of freedom itself. That's a struggle that continues, and that's the story I want to trace with you this afternoon. To understand the Texas Revolution, we have to understand a debate that was going on all across this region and really across the modern world, and continues. The question was about central control of a country versus local or regional freedom. Should a country be governed tightly from one capital or by one person, or how can regions, places with their own history and culture, have the freedom to govern themselves even while part of a larger political state? This was a political debate that Americans already knew well. It was the meaning of federalism, but don't mistake the word federal in this sense for that nasty, mean federal government way up there in Washington. What they meant was a federation of semi-independent states or regions. So the word federalism, as opposed to centralism, really means the idea that's more open to independent regions. In the United States, that debate had been worked out, at least temporarily, in favor of a federal balance between national authority and the rights of individual states. The positions laid out in the Federalist Papers, 1781 to 1788. Many of the British settlers who came into Mexican Texas brought those assumptions with them. So when Mexico would shift away from its very, very federally oriented constitution of 1824 towards a more centralized government under General Santa Anna, it struck these settlers not just as a political change, but a violation of what they understood as the proper foundation of liberty or freedom. One settler wrote a letter from the Alamo about that. That was Travis, right, who wrote about their upturning everything we stand for as Americans. And I understand that the event at the courthouse just a little while ago had to do with that particular letter. Well, this conflict in Texas then was not only local, it was part of a larger transatlantic argument about freedom and how it's carried out in a modern republic. But there was one man who, more than any other, gave a clear, thoughtful answer to that question for Texas. And his name is still all over Southeast Texas, on land grants, in names of towns, even the name of a street in South Park here in Beaumont, Zavala. He spelled it with one L, but later Texans tend to put two L's in it. But we had an aunt and uncle, I'm looking at my cousins here, who lived on Zavala Street in South Park. Lorenzo de Zavala, I've got this wrong here, Lorenzo de Zavala was a nerd in the best sense of the word. I don't have anything against nerds at all. Born in Yucatan, I mean, you can see he's the guy who gets beat up behind the drugstore, I know. He grew up in a family with roots in the independent-leaning Basque people of Spain and in the independent-leading region of Yucatan that already felt distant from central power. As a young man, he read Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and Rousseau. He came to believe deeply in a constitutional government and in the rights of regions within a larger nation. It was Zavala who helped write that Mexican Constitution of 1824, which created a federal system something like what we have in the United States, where states had real authority. For Zavala, that system was the best protection of liberty. He wrote a lengthy historical essay on the revolutions of Mexico, published in 1831, and his plea for regional autonomy within a larger nation was eloquent. And here is a quotation. He says that the federal system is not merely a form of government, It is the only secure refuge of liberty against the abuses of centralized power. But in the 1830s, Mexican federalism began to collapse. Zavala's one-time Federalist ally, General Santa Anna's centralized power, dismantled the federal structure and ruled more like a dictator. Zavala refused to go along. He eventually left Mexico, came to Texas, settled near the San Jacinto River, so he was from southeast Texas, wasn't he? And Buffalo Bayou. There's another big city over there, but it didn't exist, as you can see, in this time. Houston wasn't around yet. And he cast his lot with those resisting central control. He signed the Texas Declaration of Independence and became the first vice president of the Republic of Texas. Just months later, he died at his home at Zavala Point, in sight of the battlefield where he was eventually buried, the battlefield that defined Texas history on this date 190 years ago today. So when you see the name Zavala around Texas, it's not just a place name. It's the name of men of Spanish and Basque and Mexican heritage who carefully defined what the Texas Revolution was about. Not just rebellion, but a specific idea that liberty depends on limiting centralized power and allowing regions like Texas to shape their own future. Now, if we're going to understand how the Texas Revolution unfolded right around here in deep southeast Texas, and let's push it a little farther over, can we vote to include liberty in this, at least that far to the, I'm not saying Houston, I'm just saying as far as liberty. We need to see it through the eyes of people who lived it. So and what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is I'm going to follow a story through the lives of 5 men whose lives we could trace in diaries, letters, and official records. 3 of them were members of one family, the Hardin family. They were originally from Georgia, and by the way, for whom Hardin County is named, of course. They were originally from Georgia, then Tennessee, and like many others, they came into Texas in the 1820s and 1830s. The 3 brothers were going to follow. They had 2 other brothers and scads of other family members, but I'm going to follow 3 of them who played central roles in the Texas Revolution. A.B., that's Augustine Blackburn Hardin, along with William Hardin and Benjamin Franklin Hardin. This is the family cemetery at the Atascocito site, right adjacent to the great Sam Houston Library and Research Center over there. This is so close to Liberty that Liberty just recently extended its city limits to include it, so it's actually part of the city of Liberty now. Their story doesn't begin quietly. Blackburn Hardin came to Texas in 1825 while wanted for murder in Tennessee. He didn't come alone. He came with an enslaved man named Rankin. The 2 of them traveled through Natchitoches, crossed into Texas, and visited Nacogdoches. They made their way with a native guide down to Atascocito, the Mexican administrative center near present-day Liberty. Just north of there, with Mexican permission, but that's wrong, just south of, no, just north of there, that's right, they started developing a farm in part of what would become Hardin County. And then Blackburn wrote back and encouraged the rest of his family to come. Frank arrived in 1826, William followed in 1828, and before long this one family was deeply rooted in southeast Texas. What's especially important and sometimes surprising is that at first they were not rebels at all. They worked within the Mexican system for a decade or more. Frank Hardin in particular seems to have moved easily across cultural frontiers. He built relationships with native leaders like the Coshada chief Colita, for whom he named his first daughter. He learned Spanish. He even served as secretary of the local town council and wrote to Mexican authorities asking for a Catholic church to be established at Liberty. And it is there today, though it took a decade or 2 before it came into being. This brings us to another important part of the story. The town we call Liberty was officially laid out in 1831 under Mexican authority, with the name Libertad, celebrating Mexico's independence from Spain. Frank Hardin surveyed the town. So before this became a story about revolution, it was a story about people, British American settlers, Tejano people, native communities, all trying to build a life within Mexican Texas. Only later would that begin to change, and the Hardin brothers would find themselves in the middle of that great shift. As late as 1831, people like the Hardins and their fellow British American settler, George Orr, were not rebels at all. They were working within Mexican Texas, excuse me, loyal, at least in principle, to the Mexican Constitution of 1824, but then things began to change. As Santa Anna moved towards centralized power, and especially as word spread that he was bringing an army to Texas to enforce that, the situation shifted. Resistance began to form, and the Hardin brothers found themselves drawn into it. Blackburn Hardin would go on to sign the Texas Declaration of Independence in 1836. William Hardin, serving as alcalde, mayor of Liberty, took on both civil and military responsibilities. So the Hardins give us one perspective, that's of Southern Anglo-American settlers already rooted in this region. But two other men give us a different perspective on the same story around here. One is Joseph Pulsifer. This is a page of Joseph Pulsifer's record book that he kept meticulously. He not only wrote out letters to people, but he wrote copies of his letter in his record book. He kept diaries of events, and he wrote out copies of letters people had sent him into his record book. So it's a fantastic treasure. It was on sale in Heritage Auctions a few years ago, and they released several images of the pages of it. But Yale's Beinecke Library up in Connecticut eventually swooped it up, and they have the original there. There is a wonderful critical edition of it posted in the Gulf Coast and the Texas Gulf Coast Historical and Biographical Review by Judith Walker Lindsley and her sister Ellen Walker Rinstrup. And I recommend that. That's what I've used in my study of this. The other man, well, what Pulsifer did, he was from Massachusetts. He had been running a drugstore near Boston, but in 1835, at the age of 30, he headed south looking for opportunity. He passed through New Orleans and came to Texas and opened a drugstore in the settlement then named Santa Anna for the Mexican general, but that is, of course, the place we know as Beaumont today. If you go out to the Exxon Mobil works and you look at the little roadside park there is a historical marker for the site of Santa Anna that was the predecessor of Beaumont. But after Santa Anna the General came along, I mean, they named it for him actually, but after he turned to centralism, they quickly changed the name. And one of Pulsifer's most interesting letters, a very long letter about this period, is headed Santa Anna, now Beaumont. Okay, right? Just like that. Within 2 months, he had switched over from Santa Anna to Beaumont. Another person is William Fairfax Gray. William Fairfax Gray was a Virginia lawyer. In contrast to Pulsifer, he wrote like a very careful observer, more distant and analytical. Whereas Pulsifer gives you mud on your boots, Gray gives you measured reflections. Gray arrived in Texas in early 1836 as a land agent for a Washington, D.C. firm, already experienced, already well-connected in political and legal circles, very much focused on land and investment. Here's what makes these two especially valuable for us. They wrote down their experiences, and it's remarkable to see. Pulsifer wrote in a vivid, on-the-ground kind of way, letters and notebooks full of detail. On May the 21st, 1836, 1 month after the Battle of San Jacinto, he wrote a long letter to his sister describing everything he had seen in that period. It runs to nearly 30 pages in a print edition, Most of his papers were later destroyed in the Galveston hurricane of 1900, but one notebook survived, and this is the one that I showed you, the one that has the letter to his sister that recounts blow by blow how the Texas Revolution took place around Beaumont in the Texas Revolution. William Gray wrote in a much more formal style, but you put these voices together, Pulsifer, Gray, and the three Hardin brothers, we get something rare. We get a day-by-day, ground-level view of how the Texan Revolution unfolded right around here in this area, and that's the story I want to continue to tell you. From the summer of 1835 through the fall of the Alamo, the Runaway Scrape, and finally to San Jacinto right here as it appeared in this area. Joseph Pulsifer's story began in New Orleans in the 1830s. This is the seal of the state of Coahuila in Texas as it appears in one of the Hardin family documents in the Sam Houston Library. Pulsifer's story begins in the early flourishing English business community in New Orleans that was grounded on Mississippi River trade. You may know that Natchez, Mississippi had been a colony, well, it had been a leading city of the British West Florida colony, right? We learn about the 13 colonies, but you don't learn about the other two Spanish colonies that eventually became part of the United States. But Natchez had an English-speaking community there, and some of them came down the river to New Orleans and created this vigorous business community there. There, Pulsifer met Henry Millard, a New Yorker who had done business in Natchez and married a woman from Natchez with what name well known around here? Her surname? Beaumont. Beaumont, that's exactly right, and that's how we got that name. There he met Henry Millard, and he met Thomas Hewling of Pennsylvania. The three of them formed a partnership, J.P. Pulsifer and Company. In 1835, Pulsifer and Hewling made their way by water along the Gulf Coast. Not an easy journey. They came up from the Sabine Lake, and on Sabine Lake, they had immense problems because nobody had a chart of the, well, you know, every time I tell my brother they got grounded on a sandbar or something, my brother says, I got grounded on that sandbar too. But they didn't have a map about it, and they watched as their lighter boat, that was the only thing that could take them to shore, floated away. The Mexican cook on the ship jumped and tried to go save it, and they watched him drown. And then the next day they finally made it to shore, and they made it up here, I'm guessing somewhere along the river, roughly where the Hotel Dieu Hospital used to be, somewhere around that area. They thought they were coming to a stable, business-friendly part of Mexican Texas, but instead they stepped into a region on the edge of revolution. Just a few years earlier, Mexico had embraced these liberal ideas, but from the early 1830s, things were tightening. Immigration from the United States was restricted. Troops were being sent into East Texas, Mexican troops, and officials like Juan Davis Bradburn, got that name, Juan Davis Bradburn, an American guy who became a thoroughly Mexican guy and was really, his allegiance was to Mexico consistently despite his name. He was stationed at Anahuac, and they were ordered to enforce the new and more restrictive laws. A flashpoint came when two enslaved men escaped from Louisiana, came across the river to Texas, and ended up in Anahuac. Bradburn recognized them as free under Mexican law and enlisted them into the Mexican army. American settlers were outraged. Men like William Barrett Travis and Patrick Jack tried to intimidate Bradburn and ended up in jail themselves. That set off a series of chain reactions. In the summer of 1832, settlers gathered at James Taylor White's ranch on Turtle Bayou, just east of Anahuac. There they issued resolutions declaring their loyalty to the Mexican Constitution of 1824, and even praising Santa Anna at that time as a defender of liberty. But under the surface, there was tension.
Many of these settlers had brought enslaved people with them into a country where slavery had been strictly controlled and by 1829 was now illegal. They didn't say that in the Turtlebauer resolutions, but everyone knew it was part of the issue. Fast forward to 1835 when Pulsifer arrives. Within days, he's attending meetings right around here. He joins local settlers organizing a militia to oppose the Mexicans, as he said it. The next day, they elect officers, and then he writes, almost with surprise, that for the first time in his life, he picked up a rifle and began target practice. At the same time, life was still going on, though, and Pulsifer is running his drugstore on the Natchez, and he's trading with native people here. He says he did quite a profitable business with about a dozen native people. But he immediately runs into a problem that we would recognize today as what we call supply chain. He's got a supply chain problem. Once his medicines are gone, how's he going to get supplies into this remote and half-settled place? So you've got the map that you can see there. That's my, slightly above elementary grade, maybe, I hope, map of this area as the names appeared at this time. And with no Houston, because as I like to tell my Houston wife, it just wasn't around at that time. Within days, he's attending meetings. In November, in early September, there's a meeting here in Santa Ana. One man argues they should stay loyal to Mexico and obey the law as they had promised. But everyone else, about 20 men, voted to call a wider convention, and they began preparing for conflict. In November, Pulsifer observes that Native American families were coming east through the Beaumont area. He said, we know they're coming east because he says somebody wanted to make a placement of a gun on the prairie. Well, if I remember Beaumont well, the prairies are either south or west of Beaumont, right? So they're coming this way and they want to put a gun, but then they realize these are just scared people. They're worried about Santa Ana like everyone else, and they're heading east. I think they may be the remainder of the Orco-Kissack people from the lower Trinity River who basically disappear from this point, and I think probably amalgamated with the Attakapaw people in Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana. So that's going on. Shortly after this episode, the fighting begins. After the Battle of Gonzales in October 1835, Stephen F. Austin sends word into this region, into Liberty, up the Trinity, even up the Natchez towards Jasper. That's what they called the Bevel settlement at that time. He says there is no middle ground, there is no neutrality, and my own fifth great-grandfather, Stephen Williams, in Bevel, responded and brought his sons to fight in the siege of Behar. Other people from this region were responding. Men mount horses and head west toward the conflict. Families gather what they can and head east towards safety. Double movement happening around here. And even as all this is happening, militias forming, people moving, rumors spreading, a new layer of government is being created apart from Mexican oversight. In December 1835, a provisional Texas government representing the new settlers carved out a new municipality here in deep southeast Texas and named it Jefferson. Its original center was at a settlement called Jefferson on Cal Bayou, not very far from Orange, if you know, roughly where Bridge City is today, or maybe just a little north of there. Within a year, Texas became a republic, and it became a Texas county, with the county seat relocated here in Beaumont. So if some of you were at the event at the courthouse, that's basically where they are going to relocate that. In just a matter of months, deep southeast Texas along the Sabine, the Natchez, the Trinity, and the San Jacinto rivers was being transformed by politics, by movement, by fear, and opportunity into one of the key stages of the Texas Revolution. But while this is going on, Joseph Pulsifer had business on his mind. He's a businessman. In December, he hired a young assistant, Elisha Stevenson, to help run the drugstore. And then in February of 1836, right on the edge of war, the two of them leave for New Orleans to restock their supplies. How do you get from Beaumont to New Orleans? Well, this is how they did it. Pulsifer explains, he says, before he makes a little excuse, I think he says, people had ceased talk of war at the new year. No preparation whatsoever was made. I kind of doubt that. But he and Elisha set out by horseback by a combination of rough roads and waterways. They crossed the Natchez, probably at the site of Collier's Ferry, went north to Richardson's, that's Evadale, then to a settlement named Zavala, but not the settlement called Zavala that I drove through south of Lufkin yesterday. This was closer to the Bevel settlement, where their business partner, Thomas Hewling, had a home. From Hewling's place, they traveled the Old Spanish Road, not to be confused with our Old Spanish Trail here, and they went to Nacogdoches and then on to Natchitoches, and from Natchitoches they could catch a boat downriver to New Orleans. They purchased their goods, loaded them up, then turned right around, headed back on a westbound ship, and ended up at Sabine Pass. That's a tough way to travel and to get supplies into your business store, but that's what they were doing. In early March, they reached Sabine Pass and stayed for a time with John and Sarah McAfee, early settlers in that exposed and windswept place where, what was the restaurant we all went to? Wasn't there. Sarton's wasn't even there yet, you know. So there, the terrible news caught up with them. The Alamo had fallen, every defender was dead, and they know they're walking into a wartime scenario here. From Sabine Pass, they crossed Sabine Lake by boat, worked their way back up the Natchez River towards here, carrying their supplies and now carrying the full weight of the war that had suddenly become very real. While Pulsifer is moving back and forth along the coast and the rivers, something else is happening at the political level, and it's happening very fast. In early 1836, communities across Texas began electing delegates to a convention at Washington on the Brazos. This wasn't authorized by Mexico. It grew out of earlier meetings and an improvised government already forming among settlers. From Liberty, they chose Blackburn Hardin. From the newly created Jefferson municipality, they chose Claiborne West. At almost the same moment, another observer enters the story. That's William Fairfax Gray. He comes in along the old Spanish road that runs north of this region. He crosses the Sabine River on January 28, 1836, heading from Natchitoches toward Nacogdoches, and it's even possible that he passed Joseph Pulsifer and Elijah Stevenson on the way, going opposite directions there. He reaches Nacogdoches, stays a few days, even votes for convention delegates, already identifying himself as a 3-day-old citizen of the state of the region of Texas, let's just say right now. From there, he travels west along the same trail, the old Spanish road, and arrives at Washington on the Brazos by mid-February ahead of a convention. There he meets Lorenzo de Zavala, whom he calls the most interesting man in Texas. Noting that Zavala had already served as, and this is a quotation, governor of the state of Mexico 5 years, minister of the fiscal department, ambassador to France from the Republic of Mexico, which post he renounced when Santa Anna proved opposed to the liberal cause. Gray offers to serve as secretary of the Texas Convention. He's turned down, but he keeps notes more detailed than the official record of the convention. The convention opened at Washington on the Brazos on March 1st, 1836, while the Alamo is under siege. The very next day, March 2nd, the delegates signed the Texas Declaration of Independence. That's why we regard March 2nd as Texas Independence Day. And it also happened to be Sam Houston's birthday, so I think he liked the way this was coming along. But he wasn't there. He was out with his army. Blackburn Hardin was there. He signs the Declaration. Lorenzo de Vallo is there. He signs the Declaration. Claiborne West arrives the following day and adds his signature. The delegates chose David G. Burnett as interim president of Texas and Lorenzo de Zavala as interim vice president of independent Texas. But even as they're declaring independence, military events are overtaking them. Sam Houston's army had been moving west, but when news finally confirms that the Alamo had fallen on March 6th, everything suddenly shifts. By mid-March, the convention hears the full report, confirming that the Alamo defenders had died. you know, we say these days all the Alamo defenders died. We used to say they were all killed in battle, but there's new evidence you may know about that says some of them were actually taken prisoner, but were executed the next morning. So it amounts to the same thing, I think. They rushed to finish the Constitution on March 16th, and they began to scatter. By March 17th, Washington on the Brazos is nearly empty as people fled ahead of Santa Anna's advancing army. The plan is to regroup farther east at Harrisburg, which you see on your map, and that's part of contemporary Houston. Gray follows them. He travels east to Buffalo Bayou near Lynchburg Ferry, where both Zavala and Burnett have homes. He stays with Zavala's family, addresses him as vice president, visits the small settlement at Lynchburg, and he also witnesses something sobering. Zavala is seriously ill, weakened in a way that will lead to his death before the end of the year. He resigned 4 times, and finally it took his death to convince Burnett to accept his resignation. Now, that's one way to do it if you want to get out of a job. Now, the old road through this region, the Opelousas Trail, that branded as the Old Spanish Trail, that was an early 20th century thing when mayors and other business people from cities along the Gulf Coast wanted to create a new automobile trail. That was all the deal in the rage, and they rebrand this the Old Spanish Trail. It's kind of confusing with the Old Spanish Road, but that's what they did. And this is what Texas remembers then as, well, this leads to, what I meant to say is the Opelousas Trail, the Old Spanish Trail, becomes the main escape route for people wanting to escape from Santa Anna. And that's what's going to happen now. People fled east on foot, on horseback, and wagons, trying to stay ahead of Santa Anna's army. Gray was part of it. Pulsifer watched it unfold here in Beaumont, and what they describe is not an orderly retreat, it's just panic. On Sunday, April the 18th, Gray begins his own flight from where he was staying with Zavala. He came to the old river, an old channel of the Trinity, and found crowds jammed at the river crossing. Our grandfather, I got relatives here, my cousin Debbie, and we remember our grandfather. When the I-10 bridge finally was built over the Trinity and we could go to Houston that way instead of all the way through Liberty and on the old Highway 90 route, my grandfather saw the sign that said Old and Lost River, and he said, "There's the old and lost river, but someone found it and built a bridge over it." It's not the old and lost, it's actually the old river and the lost river. They're both old channels of the Trinity there. But what he finally did was he just gave up waiting, and he swam his horse across the old river channel, and then eventually he doesn't record this, but he must have swam his horse across the main channel of the Trinity as well, because he got to Wallaceville by that night. Rumors are flying everywhere at this time. Pulsifer heard that Mexican forces had burned Harrisburg, that was true, and that they had taken Nacogdoches again, which was not true, but fear moved faster than facts in this situation. And not everybody blamed Mexico. It's interesting, Gray records something striking near a place called the Pine Islands east of Anahuac, not the Pine Island around here by Pine Island Bayou, where Debbie and Mickey live. He encountered a woman, this is further over, closer to James Taylor White's ranch, right? He encountered a woman who turned her anger not on Santa Anna, but on the Texans themselves. Gray wrote that she expressed great wrath against the Texans for bringing on the war and its consequences, and she was eloquent in her vituperation against the members of the late convention. Some people still believe that they should have remained loyal to Mexico. Then came an even more terrifying rumor that Mexican troops, along with native allies, were coming down from Nacogdoches towards Cow Bayou, right in the path of those who were fleeing on the Runaway Scrape. Pulsifer heard it 2 days later than Gray, and he said he was thunderstruck at the report. It made it seem as though southeast Texas was trapped in a pincer, danger to the west, danger to the east. The rumor about the danger to the east proved false, but in the moment, no one knew what to believe. Pulsifer, thinking he might not survive, prepared for the worst. He packed up a small trunk of his letters and wrote to his sister that he hoped that she might receive it, quote, "in case of my death, in remembrance of me." He sent it downriver to Grigsby's Landing, that's Port Neches, and that found that the people were trying to escape there as well, but he was hoping he could get it on a boat to go back to Connecticut to his sister. Both Gray and Pulsifer described what was happening here at the Neches. Hundreds of people were gathered at the river crossings just behind me here. William Gray says he arrived at Santa Ana, Beaumont, on April 20th and saw the confusion for himself. This is a quotation. "As we approached the Neches, we found there was great uncertainty about crossing the river. The boats were said to have been taken from all the ferries and carried down to the lower bluff," which could mean Santa Ana Bluff, but I think it really meant Port Neches, Grigsby's Landing. "Thither we bent our way, passing great numbers of fugitives, men, women, and children, black and white, with all the accustomed marks of dismay." He estimated about 1,000 people at the bluff there in Port Neches, but then he came back. See, I think a lot of people looked at a map and they said, "Oh, look, Grigsby's Landing," you can see it on this map, "Grigsby's Landing is right down there, and if you just get across that lake, you're in the United States, right, from that point." Well, they didn't know what you and I know about that area, which is absolutely nothing. Well, not absolutely nothing over there, but they're not going to find a way across. So he comes back up to the Neches River. On April 21st, not knowing what was going on that day at San Jacinto, he starts building a boat with a group of men right along the river here. He bought supplies from Captain William Rogers, worked late into the evening, and with the help of Reason Green, one of the early settlers at Orange, he managed to get their gear across. But then he was so tired that he spent the night on this side of the river, and then in the morning on April 22nd, he continued east, went across the river, reaching the Sabine, crossing into Louisiana a few days later, still completely unaware of what had been happening behind him. Because on that same morning, April 22nd, here in Beaumont, Joseph Pulsifer hears the news. San Jacinto had been fought. There's my map. There's the quotation I should have shown you. And this is what Joseph Pulsifer writes about the morning of April 22nd. "O Lucy, how my heart did jump for joy to hear this most welcome tidings." And that was 190 years ago yesterday. Tomorrow, when he was actually writing that, but about what happened 190 years ago today. Even with the victory, the suffering didn't end overnight. Families began returning, but to scarcity and sickness. Pulsifer describes flour selling at 10 cents a pound, corn at $2 a bushel, and almost every family bringing illness back with them. He tells of staying up all night with a young man trying to return to his home in Texas, but dying of measles. Pulsifer eventually prepares the man's body and digs the grave himself so he would expose no one else. I think he was living a block away from the courthouse. In fact, the courthouse, his house became the first courthouse, and people had been buried on the bluff over behind the courthouse where the shipyards are now, right? The Beaumont shipyards are at that location. But between late May and early June, he wrote out this long story, everything he had seen, and that long letter to his sister still allows us to follow all these events. So after these events, Texas leaders moved very quickly to turn a battlefield success into a functioning government, and once again, deep southeast Texas was right at the center of things. President David G. Burnett asked William Hardin to take charge of about 300 Mexican prisoners who had been promised safe passage home. They were brought by ship to Anahuac and then moved upriver to Liberty. Hardin took charge of their care and made sure they were properly provided for, housing the wounded, even opening his own home to them. And his brother Frank's men, just back from the campaign, stood guard. But among those prisoners was one man who made the situation especially difficult. General Martin Perfecto de Cos. Hardin knew him well. Just a few months earlier, after the siege of Behar, Cos had passed through Liberty and asked Hardin for supplies to return to Mexico. Hardin helped him generously after Coast promised to honor the Mexican Constitution of 1824 and never to return to Texas. Hardin even gave him a pair of fine leather riding boots to take back with him. Now Coast was back, having broken his promise, and he was standing there as a prisoner wearing the same boots. The Texian soldiers knew the story, and they were furious. Most of them wanted Coast executed on the spot, but Hardin held the line. Following Burnett's orders, he insisted that the prisoners be treated properly no matter how dire the circumstances. Still, not everyone could resist a stroke of frontier justice. One night, an enslaved man slipped into Coast's quarters, quietly removed the boots, stuffed them with live male skunks, waited until the skunks had done their work, and then returned the boots very carefully to the sleeping general. Goodbye, and good riddance. Despite the tension, the Hardins kept their word. A Mexican officer later wrote a formal report praising the way they had treated the prisoners, especially noting the members of the Hardin family, including women who had petitioned Texas officials to assure the prisoners' safe return to Mexico. Some of those prisoners even chose to remain in Texas. So even here at the close of the revolution, you see the same mix we've been seeing all along in southeast Texas. Conflict, restraint, anger, obligation, people trying sometimes imperfectly to decide what freedom was really going to mean in practice. William Fairfax Gray made it out safely back through Louisiana, then to his family in Virginia, but Texas drew him in. Within a year, he moved his whole family to Houston, which was created by then, which became part of a new republic's leadership. He became part of the leadership, serving as clerk of the Texas House, secretary of the Senate, and first clerk of the Texas Supreme Court before his death in 1841. His remains have been moved more than once, but he is laid to rest at the Glenwood Cemetery along Memorial Drive in Houston. Joseph Pulsifer just stayed right here in Beaumont, became a steady presence in the life of the region. In fact, the Jefferson County Court met in his combined home and store until a proper courthouse could be built. He held a number of civic roles in Beaumont and the surrounding county and died in 1861, the first year of the Civil War. We do not know where he was buried, but it may well be that the bluff behind the present courthouse, close to his home, where he once helped bury victims of disease during the Runaway Scrape, is where he himself was eventually buried. Nobody, so far as I know, has studied this or done an archaeological survey. I mean, I just took this picture without, but there's all kinds of interesting stuff. There's ceramics, and there's clam shells, and there's burned wood and so forth, and we need to get some local archaeologists into that. But so far as I know, there's no monument to Joseph Pulsifer around here, and he's a kind of character I sort of like. I wish we could find a way to honor him. William Hardin had a sharp eye for land. After the Revolution, he helped broker the purchase of land along Buffalo Bayou for the Allen brothers, the land they bought in 1836 for $5,000, and which today is downtown Houston, Allen's Landing. It didn't look like much at that time. A visiting Catholic official, the Abbé Dominic, described Houston like this in 1838. Houston is a wretched little town composed of about 20 shops and 100 huts, dispersed here and there among trunks of felled trees. It is infested with Methodists and ants. Infested. I love that. That's an attitude. Yeah. So, right, there's William Hardin. William Hardin moved on to Galveston, continued in land ventures, while the extended Hardin family spread across Liberty and what would soon become Hardin County. Among their descendants was a Methodist preacher who named his son with great piety John Wesley Hardin. That son, of course, became one of the most spectacular badasses in Texas history, which does make you wonder about what the Abbé Dominic said about the Methodists. The Hardin family continued as leaders in Liberty and Hardin counties for generations. Blackburn and William lie in the Hardin County Cemetery at Old Atascocito, Frank in the Liberty City Cemetery. So far as I know, as I say, there's no monument to Pulsifer, but he carried the excitement of early Southeast Texas, the fear, the excitement. He was able to convey that, not in William Fairfax Gray's fancy words, but in his own sort of homespun prose. The question of what freedom really meant is a question that's hard to get away from. It's going to be part of the Civil War, when southern states are going to claim states' rights, meaning, in that case, the right to hold enslaved human beings. It's going to become part of the modern world. The Basque people in Spain, Lorenzo de Zavala's people, continue to assert their distinct identity in a nation with a strong national state. Kurdish communities today remain divided across the borders of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, still seeking recognition and autonomy. Most urgently, the question of Palestinians within modern Israel seems to be an almost intractable problem as we've tried over and over to deal with it. But what about Southeast Texas within Texas? You may not have noticed this, but this is not West Texas. This is not Hollywood, Texas. This is not Dallas. And it's not even Houston, even though some people in Beaumont do like to think of Houston as a western suburb of Beaumont. This is a different kind of place, and that's what I'm trying to describe in the book I'm working on about Southeast Texas, and going back to look at its native people as well as the other people like Acadian people and Creole people and lots of other interesting people, enslaved African people, free African people. What an interesting group of people we have here in Southeast Texas. Thank you. That's what I have to say about that. I'm to try to entertain questions as best I can. So what do you think? Or what are you asking?
You mentioned states' rights,
Yes.
federalism.
Yes.
Do you see a comparison with the history of what's going on in American days?
Do I see a comparison with the history of what's going on in America today? Yes, we go back and forth between those who want to emphasize a strong presidency and whatever else you say about our current president. We've got a strong, he wants to be a strong president. There's no question about that. And yet, it does raise that issue about is the executive branch the branch that declares wars and so on and so forth. I mean, so yeah, I think that's very much the kind of debate that we're having. I wasn't going to mention it, but I figured somebody would probably ask. Yeah, that's very much the debate we're having now. Yes?
De Zavala, a lot of his, he had the impresario. He actually didn't do any of the land grants here, is that right?
No, that's right. As I
He
understand it,
gave
he became the impresario over a huge region, but then he and Burnett went to New York City and they made a deal to create a land company that was given one really unique privilege, and that was to sell land along the coast, which up to that point the Mexican government had not allowed, but when they allowed them to sell land along the coast, that Texas land, what was it called? So many deeds go back to that. But that was his, I mean, he got the income from the land that they sold. That's the way I understand it.
Well, my follow-up, my reason why I asked that question is because, I've been looking for land grants that they gave here in this area, but
Yes.
I mean, he did with Galveston land and whatever they
Yes.
called. But
Galveston land and immigration.
right, I have not been able to find any maps or anything that show those land grants where they were. And I think maybe you can answer this, that they might be at that Yale library because they were in that collection that Yale bought. All of Galveston, all that land company's records.
I'm not aware of that. I'm only aware that they bought that particular volume of Joseph Pulsifer's.
They bought that, they have the collection that has all of the Galveston, all of that New York company's paperwork.
Wow, I did
Yale
not
has
know that. That would be fantastic. Give me the note. By the way, some of my cards are up here if you want to be in touch. you have ideas or questions and so forth. I'd love to hear about that. That would be very
Well,
interesting.
because, like, I'm looking specifically for Ashworth, like, where their land grant was, and I know they got it through that, and William Hardin actually signed off the character, you know, the
I mean, William Ashworth is one of the most fascinating people in Southeast Texas. You know, that's who you're talking about, and his brothers.
Yes,
These are
and-
4 free black men who came to Southeast Texas and became fabulously wealthy in the 1840s. They were,
There's no map of where their land was.
well, yeah, interesting. I didn't know that, but they're listed in the U.S. censuses then and so forth as having more cattle than other people in the state. But William was married to a woman named Delida, who was a French
Yeah,
woman, yes, and she's buried in the Spell family cemetery in Rosedale here in Beaumont. That's the cemetery that my dad and his brother had kept up for years and years and years, and family members are still keeping it up. But when I read her story, my jaw almost hit the floor. I mean, she's now got a Citizen of the Republic of Texas star on her grave, but when you learn about her husband and the wars that went on about them and so forth, it's a remarkable story. Steven Spielberg needs to think about this. Somebody. Maybe Ken.
I've just been on a hunt for where his land actually was, and all the maps that show the land grants,
Interesting.
they don't show the Ashworth land grants.
They don't have surveys.
Well, they were invalidated, or they didn't invalidate it, they came and said that they were. Anyway, I don't want to get, that's a whole other thing,
It's
but
a fascinating story.
Yeah. I just was wondering about the Yale thing.
I didn't know that.
You mentioned the old Spanish road a lot.
Yes.
Is that the same as the Camino del Rey, the King's Highway in Nacogdoches?
Yes,
We live in
it's-
Nacogdoches, that's what it's called.
The only thing I would say about that is it was designated as a Camino Real. It was designated as a royal highway, a highway with royal privilege or royal support. It is not the Camino Real because there were several in North America. There are Caminos Reales in California and New Mexico and so forth. But it was a royal road, and that means it was, you know, the main road. It's just, it doesn't go anywhere where people are going today, from San Antonio to East Texas. Well, except we got Nacogdoches folks here. They're great for y'all, but yeah. But this road along the coast, I think, is one of the most understoried parts of Texas history, because as far as I mean, this road, the old, you can call it the Opelousas Trail because it goes to Opelousas that way and the east, but it's also the La Bahia Trail because it goes to La Bahia or Goliad in the west, and that's hugely important. I mean, James Taylor White, you know, this is the road he would have traveled to come to Texas to get cattle and so forth, and I don't know anybody's put together that story. Thank you all very much. I'm delighted you've come out today. I have a petition for you. Please keep telling stories in your families and writing them down. Thanks.